So welcome, Joyce. So will you start off with letting us know your name and your title and any experience you've had dealing with child welfare issues?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Joyce James. I am currently president and CEO of Joyce James Consulting, where I provide technical assistance, support, and training to various systems and institutions around the country who are working to create an anti-racist culture so that all of the people that they serve have an opportunity for equitable outcomes. I am a social worker by profession. I started my career as a frontline child protective services caseworker in the state of Texas, and I was fortunate and blessed to be able to move up the career ladder, holding several different positions on up to being the first African American to serve as the director of the Texas Child Protective Services Program in 2004. Prior to that, as a regional director, I had initiated work to address racial inequities in foster care. I was able to develop a model that I took to the state level with me and was instrumental in testifying before the Texas legislature uh, so that Texas became the first state in the country to have a law requiring child protective services to address the racial inequities. After that, and with the success that we had in that work, another piece of legislation was passed in Texas, and I was actually appointed to lead the Center for Elimination of Disproportionality and Disparities at the Health and Human Services Commission. And I also led the State Office of Minority Health for 3 years. And finally, just to say, Senate Bill 501 and that center also charged me with expanding my model beyond child welfare to examining and making recommendations for reducing racial inequities in education, juvenile justice, health, and mental health. So I've been out of state service since 2013, and I've been a full-time consultant working on these issues with many systems and institutions across the country.
Yeah, it sounds like you definitely have a lot of experience on the topic. But for some of our attendees who don't necessarily have that same experience, can you define for us disproportionality and disparity, and then talk a little about why this is important for children and families of color?
Sure. So what I usually tell people is that disproportionality is a new word for an age-old problem. So we used to call it overrepresentation, and actually it is the over or underrepresentation of a particular group or race in a system as compared to their representation in the general population. And research has shown that both African American and Native American families and their children are overrepresented in the child welfare system relative to white children and families in virtually every state in this country. So it's really important to understand that from a systemic place. That if we only saw it in a few places, we might be able to look at it at an individual level. But the fact that it is in all of our systems, not just child welfare, then it means that we have to have a deeper analysis and look at the root causes of this. So disparity in comparison is the comparison of the ratio of one race or ethnic group in an event as compared to another race in that same event. And so, for example, we know that Black children in foster care experience more moves, that they are less likely to be adopted, that they're less likely to be reunited with their families. And so we know that there's a relationship between disproportionality and disparities, and that disparity actually increases the potential for disproportionality to occur. And so you were asking me why it's important. Is that where, was that my next question?
Yeah, why is this important for children and families of color?
Well, it's really important for children and families of color in that, as I previously said, it's not just about child welfare, but it is about the experiences of children and families of color across multiple systems and institutions, be it education, child welfare, juvenile justice, criminal justice, health, housing, employment, you name it, the same families have the worst of outcomes in all of these systems and institutions. And I would say that it is deeply rooted in the history of institutional and structural racism. And it's important as it relates to that this has been going on for a very, very long time, that there's a history of it, that it's still embedded in the very fabric of our systems and institutions, and that it is important that we understand the root causes of disproportionality and disparities, because we have been trained to treat the symptoms of a much deeper problem. And when we only treat the symptoms, then we don't achieve the outcomes that, as helping professionals, we come to our work to achieve. And so, I approach this work from my belief that people in helping professions come to their work to help and not to hurt. But without an analysis and an understanding of the root cause of these issues, we continue to unintentionally cause harm. And what it creates, because it impacts across systems, the same communities, the same populations of people, is that it creates a state of oppression that runs very deep, that it creates community loss that people experience in regard to their relationships with systems and institutions that come every day in the name of health. Yet when you examine the data and outcomes, we're not helping in the way that we intend to help. And so, the importance of it, I can't even speak to how critically necessary it is that we move away from the socialization that we have had around our role as helping professionals is to develop programs and services to, in my words, fix broken people. That instead we have to become bold, courageous, and accountable leaders who are willing to at least have some mutual accountability for not what's wrong with the children, youth, and families that we serve, but rather what has happened to them. And for me, that means that we have to become critical lovers of our systems and institutions. We have to love work we have chosen to do so much that there are no pieces of it that we are unwilling to critically examine and analyze, disaggregate by race and ethnicity so that we have the real story about what is happening to people, and to consider the brokenness of our systems and institutions.
So my second to last question is, how do you recommend state lawmakers go about identifying and addressing the issue of disproportionality?
Before I answer that question, if I might just mention the third piece of legislation that Texas passed, because as I travel around the country and I share that Texas was the first state to have the kind of legislation that required us to actually remediate our enforcement actions to reduce disproportionality is what it was about. People say, Texas? And so, and I say yes. And I say, if we can do this work in Texas, then that means you can do it anywhere, right? So Senate Bill 501 was passed in 2011. And it was the bill that actually ended up in my transition from the Department of Family and Protective Services to the Texas Health and Human Services Commission, which was the umbrella agency for all of these state systems. And it was there that the legislation required, as I mentioned earlier, that we expand this racial equity lens and this training. It created an interagency council and it required the state leaders of child welfare, of juvenile justice, of the education agency, of health, and of mental health to participate in an interagency council. It also included representatives from the governor's office. It included a representative from the Supreme Court Commission, Judicial Commission on Children, Youth, and Families. It included members of our advisory councils from across the state, community and faith-based and foster youth. And we were required to examine racial inequities across those systems and to report to the legislature on it. And, in a way, I'm saying hold systems accountable. That's what legislators can do, right? You can hold systems accountable for digging deeper, for going to the source of these problems and not continuing to create all of these programs and services. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need programs and services, but we will never not need them unless we go to the root cause of these problems. And so we did submit a report as directed by the legislature in 2012. I was the presiding officer of that interagency council with many, many recommendations for how we could reduce the racial inequities within our system. And so I would say to legislators to, first of all, if you have not immersed yourselves in having an analysis and an understanding of the history of institutional and structural racism in this country and how it still lives and breathes in the very fabric of all of our systems and institutions, to be intentional and deliberate about doing that. Not from a place of, am I racist or not, but from a place of accountability to all of the children, youth, and families that we serve. To have your state leaders come in prepared to answer questions as it relates to who are your programs and services working for? Because you can present it in a way that it looks so good, and if it's not disaggregated by race and ethnicity, sometimes the people that are doing really well are such that it overshadows the disproportionality and disparities that we see. And have regular reporting, have state leaders talk about what are their plans for how they're going to address these issues. Create a space for them to tell you what they really need to do the kind of work that has to be done at that level. And again, don't shy away from the discussion, because what I can tell you too is that there is no quick fix to the hundreds of years of oppression that people have experienced. And I would be remiss not to mention the history of Native Americans and the child welfare system and the trauma that they still have to deal with today as it relates to the years and years ago when Native children were removed from their families and their whole culture taken away from them, forbidden to speak their language, having their hair cut, placing them in white Christian homes. And in essence, if we are willing to tell the truth, it was about assimilation. And that assimilation included using white education to educate them, right? So that they would lose everything that they believed in and valued. And even as the ICWA laws have been put in place, it really has not altered, as it should have, the experiences of our Native American children who are still disproportionately represented in our system. And I know today that there is a push to dismantle ICWA. And I would strongly urge that we not do that we not dismantle ICWA, but that rather we work to strengthen it and to better enforce it so that we began to at least work to reduce some of the trauma that this population has felt for so very, very long. And so we need to create anti-racist cultures. out of which all of our systems operate. Because again, and recognize, I would say to state legislators, recognize the relationship that all of these systems have to the same communities and the same population of people. So we know what happens to African American and Native American children in virtually every foster care system across this country. But we also know that this happens to the same children in the education system, and that you would include your Hispanic Latino population, that education systems across the country are failing these children. And you notice I didn't say the children are failing. We have to develop some new understanding so that we have some new language and some new consciousness and some new awareness with which to do this work, and to lift the burden solely off of individuals and to have some institutional accountability. Juvenile justice is the same. Black and brown youth are more likely to be adjudicated, sent to state lockup, certified to stand trial as adults. And if that's all we know, then we think that it's because their behaviors are more egregious. But when we know the rest of the story, that happens to them when white peers commit those same acts, and often more egregious acts, and that courts all across this country, and it doesn't matter the race of the judge, is more likely to send Black and brown youth to lockup and white youth to treatment. Now, that's not about an intentional act of meanness, hatred, and bigotry, but it is about understanding how deeply we have been socialized around race. And if we are not conscious of that, most often we don't even know we're doing it. We have to become accountable for examining how we've been socialized to see and to allow race to be the #1 predictor of a person's outcomes in every one of our helping systems.
Wow, that was a lot. And so just for the last question, I would say, what major takeaway do you hope legislators leave this conversation with?
You know, what has made the difference everywhere that I have been, and even made the difference for me early in my career, because I didn't always have this analysis that I have now. You know, I can look back on the harm that I unintentionally caused in my work. And so I would say leave with an open mind about having a space to begin to examine the institutional and structural racism, examining the data. If you don't have the capacity to get some, there are many experts from around the country who can come in and lead a dialogue that's not about pointing fingers and laying blame, but it's about becoming more accountable and holding each other accountable. And for legislators to have language and a lens to hold systems leaders accountable for changing the outcomes that exist today.
Thank you very much for your time and words of wisdom, Joyce.